Okay, hi everyone. We're at one of the first stops here. This is the Darlingtonia plant wayside, and this is the geology trip. So what are we doing stopping at a plant site? Well, let's take a closer look at some of these plants and turn this around. These are the Darlingtonia plants. They're really cool. They're a carnivorous plant. They're related to pitcher plants, other kinds of pitcher plants, but these are actually the only species within its entire family. And these plants are also endemic to this area. So endemic means found nowhere else in the world. They're found in Northern California, kind of around Mount Shasta, and up into Southern Oregon, right around here. But here's where the geology is going to come in. These plants, like most carnivorous plants, specialize in living in rather extreme conditions that a lot of other plants can't. They eat insects or digest them as a source of nitrogen. So nitrogen is really limited in these very wet, kind of boggy environments. Most carnivorous plants are only living in very acidic bogs. These ones can live in those acidic bogs. But unlike most carnivorous plants, the Darlingtonias are unique in that they can also live in ultramafic soils. So if we think back to our igneous rocks, these are the really green or very dark black minerals that are forming out of melts. And these are often really, really basic soils. So they have other ways in which they limit nutrients. One of our common minerals in the area is serpentinite. So these are some of the kind of plants that can deal with both these rocks and minerals that produce effectively toxic soil, as well as these really, really wet, nitrogen limited sort of areas. And here's just a little bit about them, a little diagram. They have flowers that are up on big stalks because they don't want to eat their pollinators. So you have to keep your flowers separate from where you're trapping and eating insects, or it'd be sort of counterintuitive to be accidentally killing off all of your pollinators at the same time. This is a cool little wayside because it has accessible boardwalks and nice restroom. If you're kind of stopping through here, you can hear the traffic sound because it's just barely off of 101. Just off the road, we have this really important, unique ecosystem living here, dictated by the geology. Okay, hi everyone. Waving. We're at our next stop. This is Smelt Sands, and we're going to start to take a look at the rocks that are outcropping here. So we have what we call bedrock, our rocks that are in place here, as well as our really abundant sediments, the sands that give this site its name. And we're going to start to think about some of our themes for this trip. This is going to be our relationship between different rock types, how this relates to geologic hazards, as well as really concentrating in on some of the sediment and the amount of energy that's associated with producing and moving different types of sediments. So to start out with, we've got these bedrocks that are outcropping in different places, as well as eroding and weathering into these boulders on the beach. Let's go take a closer look at some of these. What kind of rock type do we think this is? We don't really have a lot of visible individual grains or crystals. So this is going to be one of our igneous rocks. This is a basalt, and this basalt is from our start of our Cenozoic, our age of mammals. So this is dated to be sort of within 40 to 50 million years old, likely, early on for the age of mammals. It's been pretty heavily weathered by our seawater, so we have this very red area. What do you think's happened to some of our minerals within our basalt to make it very red? Nice thing to think about. We also have these really cool areas where we have these white minerals filling in our vesicles or bubbles or airspace that were within our basalt as well as little veins kind of in between them. What kind of white minerals could we have infilling this? How could we tell what kind of white mineral we had if we wanted to test these? So primarily we have this set of igneous rocks. They're fairly tough, so they're part of why they're resisting erosion. We're getting our coastal landforms forming here, sticking out into the ocean. But this isn't going to be our only rock that's exposed here. If I pan around back to the beach where I just came in, what do we see right over here? Even from a distance, does that look like one of our igneous rocks? Let's wander back over this direction and take a closer look. We have this beautiful relationship over in this corner where we can see our basalt coming into contact with this other material. If this is on top of our basalt, is it going to be older or younger than our basalt? If you answered younger, you would be correct. Here we have what we call a conglomerate. So this is our large class sizes or grains of smaller or other rocks. They are larger than 2 millimeters in diameter, many of these by quite a bit, and they're really rounded. So remember, breccia are our angular large class rocks, conglomerates are our rounded large class rocks. They're pretty well cemented together, so I have my matrix material here around my individual class. Even this one that's sticking out, yes, I'm a weakling, but I'm exerting a fair amount of force on it, and this isn't budging. So it's solidified into a rock. As it weathers, this material's coming out. Again, we've got a lot of this red and orange going on. So what might be some of our minerals involved in cementing this together? We don't know how old this conglomerate is just by looking at it, other than that we can say this is older and related to our basalt. If we come over here, we can start to see some of this really interesting contacts. We actually have some of our basalt being really weathered and eroded, and directly on top of it, we have this contact between our conglomerate and our basalt. This contact is what we call an erosional surface. So our basalt eroded away and something deposited this pile of gravel that we can see extending out along here on top of this basalt. How much energy do you think it's going to take to move some of these very large class sizes? What kind of environments might we expect to be seeing some of these really rounded large rocks? We have a pretty cool analog going on for this right now. Our sands at Smelt Sands are a little misleading. This is actually going to be our one stop where our beach isn't made out of sand. So I just reached down and scooped up a handful of this. Most of these pieces are larger than that 2 millimeter cutoff that we consider sand. We've got a nice, what we call a pebble. Geologists are really particular about this. Most of these are in the kind of small pebble size to what we would call granules. They're really well rounded. They've been abrading against each other as the surf moves them back and forth. We have some shells, some organic material that's being mixed in here. How many different rock types do we think we can see in here? Even just thinking about our colors. We've got a lot of different colors in here. So while our conglomerate back here is a little bit coarser, we've got a really similar environment. This beach sands here, where we're collecting a lot of rocks, mixing them together, and we would just need a chance to cement them together. Seawater is full of all sorts of minerals, so a great way to add that in. Now, our final little factoids we'll have for this particular site, we can kind of walk out and take a look at this. we have these lovely little spots with these kind of gravelly, sandy areas accumulating in between the basalt that's outcropping here. And this is where we're gonna get the name Smelt Beach from, smelt sands. Smelts are tiny little fish, they're about that long, and they're kind of unique in that instead of laying their eggs out in the water like most fish do, they actually come up on the beach during high tide and they spawn and lay their eggs so that they stick to this gravel. So it means that when the waves continuously break over it, it's adding lots and lots of oxygen in and helping to sort of protect their eggs as well from a lot of predators that are maybe out in the ocean. Granted, maybe they're more at risk for birds. Because these fish would literally come into the shallows and beach themselves up onto the beach, this has been a really important resource, both for people in the last 100 years living here, but going back thousands and thousands of years, whenever the spawning seasons would come, this was a really amazing resource for a huge amount of food sources for indigenous peoples in the area. So that's where you get your smelt sands for your name from, is surf smelt, a type of fish coming here to lay its eggs.
Same as the top of the terrace.
Okay folks, we are at our next stop, Strawberry Hill. Called Strawberry Hill in part because a lot of our soils that are weathering out here are very red, or at least I'm assuming that's where the name is originally coming from. And we've still got a lot of this basalt outcropping. We've just come a little bit south from Devil's Churn. We're not that far away. There's Cape Perpetua up there. So we've still got the basalt, but I'm standing on something a little bit different. We have this very straight section of rock that doesn't look quite like the basalt we've been seeing. So if we look at this, I'm not seeing any individual crystals. I'm not seeing individual grains. So that's telling me this is an intrusive igneous rock, but it looks different than our basalt around us. It's also in this real suspiciously straight line. Nature doesn't love straight lines, so when you see a straight line, it's telling you something a bit different has happened and is going on. If anyone can remember back to our introduction to igneous rocks, when we have magma, so our molten rock below ground, rising up towards the surface, if it comes up in this sort of slice rising towards the surface, we call this a dike. So this stuff I'm standing on right now, there's my feet, continuing on down, we can look in the other direction and see this kind of little fin going back up towards the parking lot. This is a dike that intruded molten rock into the surrounding materials around it. This is also going to be another great chance to think about this relationship between different layers. If we have our basalt down there and we have this rock cutting through it, which one's younger? Stop and think about it. If one of them is cutting through the other, which one has to be younger? Our basalts were between 40 and 50 million years old from our Eocene period. So we can infer that this dike cutting through represents younger rocks. This is called relative dating. We don't know exactly how old this is by looking at it, but we do know that it's younger than what it cuts through. This is going to be our law of cross-cutting relationships that we'll get to later in the term. Now, another kind of fun little bonus out here is if we look out on this basalt kind of section sticking out and I zoom in, apologies that my phone is not fancy enough to be real high quality. See all those little gray blobs? Those are harbor seals. A really lot of harbor seals. They take this as a chance that they're kind of far enough out to be away from people and things that could harass them or eat them. And it's a chance to rest and relax. So we'll see them here quite frequently. Again, we've got this just beautiful wave cut platform, this sort of flat area. We can see this extending towards the north in that direction. And then we've got these younger sedimentary rocks. So they're on top of our basalt, higher up. They're going to be younger. Our dike is also, we can't quite see our relationship between those, so we'd have to kind of think about that, walk around a little bit. Let's go look closely at this sedimentary rock here. It comes apart pretty easily. If I put it in my hand, it's sand. It's really red orange sand. So what kind of minerals and things might be going on with it? Got some dark grains, but overall just really reddish. This is also kind of cool here. We can see these kind of faint layers. So these represent something about the environment that this was being deposited in. What kind of places do we get a lot of sand being deposited? Dunes, beaches. These kind of little angles that we're seeing between them are called cross-bedding. When sand builds up at an angle, it can form these kind of cross-hatched layers within it. Typically, if this formed in a dune, we would expect higher angles. These are all pretty low lying. So probably these sands were deposited in a beach that was later uplifted a bit more. Okay, hello, we're at our next stop. This is going to be Devil's Churn. It's got a great pull-off, some bathrooms, nice place to stop. But the big show that we're really looking at is this area right down here, this long, kind of narrow canyon that's kind of cut in. If we watch it for a little bit, we can start to see that every time a wave comes in, this is going to kind of slosh up. At really high tides or during storms, we'll have huge waves coming out of this area here. So what kind of rock type does this look similar to that we saw at some of our previous stops? It's dark in color. Yes, we're quite a ways away, but it's fairly uniform. If you guess basalt, one of our extrusive igneous rocks or volcanic rocks, you're correct. This basalt, again, is from the Eocene period, so it's somewhere between 40 and 50 million years old. There's some thought that this basalt might actually relate to our Yellowstone hotspot. So we can see a corridor of where the Yellowstone hotspot has left its mark, making the Snake River Plain through Idaho, and now in its site where it is today, Yellowstone. But there's a lot of debate about exactly what happened when that hotspot hit our subduction zone on the Pacific coast. So there's some thought that some of this is kind of some of its last hurrah before being totally subducted, producing all of this basalt. We see it quite a bit up and down the Oregon coast here. A really spectacular viewpoint here. We can see our waves coming in these nice shelves. We had some sort of fracture along here. It was a weaker place. It allowed waves and water to get in and break that apart. Every time it would break some off, it's able to increase the amount of weathering that it can do. So what kind of weathering do we have going on here? We have ocean waves kind of actively working on this. We're gonna have both physical weathering, so the physical force of the waves picking up other rocks and sand, smashing them into the coast. We're also going to have chemical weathering. So we have a lot of dissolved materials in our ocean water. Water is really, really good at dissolving rocks over time. So both chemical and physical weathering going on here. We probably also have biological weathering going on. Boring clams, our mussels and barnacles, as they attach to the rocks, are going to be eroding some of this away. Lots going on here. We also have what we call a wave cut platform. So this flat kind of level surface we can hear was at one time eroded to that level by the action of waves. We have quite a bit of change in our elevation on the Oregon coast. It's lifting up through time. Every time we have a Cascadia megathrust earthquake, though, that's going to drop it back down. So it can give us this really great story of what exactly is happening, our tectonic processes, and maybe even a little bit of insight into how likely stuff like our next Cascadia megathrust earthquake is going to be. For scale, we have some people walking around down here. You can see this is quite a big feature. Got a lot of erosion going on there against our basalt. Neat area to come check out if you want to see a little bit more of this area. Here's one of our waves coming in, smashing and churning around through the crack here. Okay, one more video. We've walked down our path from Devil's Churn. We are now down in the area where the churn is. So the part we can kind of see furthest up is back there. We can see our water coming out. We have a new wave coming in. It's smashing against the walls in this relatively narrow area. That's a lot of force and energy. What do we think our sediment size in the base of this is going to be? Think about how this might compare to the amount of waves that we saw at Smelt Beach or Smelt Sands Beach and some of the places keep in mind for later on. Okay, let's take a little bit of a closer look at some of our rocks here as well. It's definitely a little chilly. There's not too many times that you can see ice right next to the ocean. Pretty cool and wild. I'm standing on the rocks here. These are our bedrocks. This is our basalt. So this is pretty weathered, kind of messed up basalt, but we can still see a lot of our vesicles, our bubbles. So this is our extrusive igneous rock. This cools very quickly, so we don't have time to form and grow large visible individual crystals. So we would call this type of rock our volcanic or extrusive, but also aphanetic. So we can't see individual crystals. If I look down at some of the sediment in different places, I've got some larger glass size, some gravel in here. Again, ice, which is pretty cool. We can kind of watch some melting water traveling under that ice. I can't personally say I've ever seen ice tide pools, so I'm pretty entertained by this. We've got this good mix of some of these weathered rocks coming in here. Lots of our basalt. So our bedrock, the part that's still really firmly attached here, is all of this basalt. Think about how much energy it's going to take to get gravel all the way up on that wave cut platform there. We can really see how flat that is. But what about if we look right behind us? This is kind of cool. We have another sedimentary rock forming some of these walls. Just like we saw at the last place, we have a finer matrix. In this case, it's very muddy. So see how it's leaving behind little tiny pieces. It squishes easy. This is like clay-sized pieces. But then we have big angular rocks in this. Sharp corners. So this is on its way to becoming a breccia rather than one of our conglomerates like we saw at the last place. This is gonna form in some different kinds of ways. So instead of being likely the wave action, this is probably a landslide deposit. So bits of the basalt that were broken and slid down the hill with mud, my hands look really lovely now, and all got deposited here. If this doesn't all erode away, it could cement together more and be a kind of more proper breccia at some point. Just giving you a chance to kind of walk out here and see a little more of this. Got some tide pools here, again with ice on top of them, which is cool to see. I will try not to fall during filming a video. We've got a little bit of finer grain sediment, possibly being wind transported. But our coarser gravels are from this just incredible amount of wave action going on here. We go from a huge, broad, open area to a very narrow, confined area. So this is confining the energy. It's concentrating and increasing the amount of energy in each of these places. Here's that path we just walked down. I'm gonna stop videotaping to go back up. One last little pano of these neat waves coming in here. Okay, so this is a bonus video content. This isn't going to be one of our stops on the field trip for those in person, but this is the Cape Perpetua overlook. So if we pan to the north, kind of through the trees over here is back towards Devil's Churn. We were just kind of over around that corner for Devil's Churn. And this particular area is called Cape Perpetua because in 1778, Captain James Cook sighted this area on March 6th and called it Cape Perpetua. There's a little bit of debate as to why. It was the possibly in reference to a saint's day that was happening on that day. Maybe it was because it was perpetually in sight, kind of no matter where they sailed. But either way, that was the first white person name given to this area. Obviously, this was an area heavily used for mussel collection, a lot of other things by indigenous peoples in the area. So it certainly had names before that, but it has the name Cape Perpetua still. And again, kind of cool, we can see ice over here. Not something you see all that often on the coast. We also have a really great example about prevailing wind conditions. So look at how sculpted all of these trees are. We can see the wind coming in. We also have this very dynamic, active coastline. We have a lot of coastal erosion going on here. We can look at these waves coming in very square. They're gonna break first against these headlands, so the part sticking out the most, wrap around. They can start to form things like sea caves. Some of these areas get called churns, where we have these kind of smaller areas that funnel the water up and through them. Very, very active area. It's a little stormy today, so I'm not seeing any, but very frequently these rocks also have a lot of harbor seals that'll pull out on them. Hello again. We are now at the Heceta Head Lighthouse stop. So this is going to be a really cool place where we're going to look at quite a few different things going on with the geology, as well as a little bit of human history in the area. So first of all, back here behind me, this is where our Heceta Head Lighthouse is. It's kind of behind the trees a little bit there, but just up on the top of Heceta Head. This was our lighthouse keeper's house. This is a museum that during public hours you can walk in and go up to. It's really cool. This area is no longer an active lighthouse, but it was a really, really important lighthouse. This is an area that has a lot of rocks kind of off the coast. There's a huge history of shipwrecks along the Oregon coast. So this was really important for protecting people using this area. But from our geology perspective, this has got a lot of really, really neat things going on. We've still got a lot of our basalt. We can kind of maybe see it closest in this cliff over here. But we're also going to have some spots where we have some of this different rock cutting across it. We'll see quite a few dikes in this area. I'm also walking on this really interesting beach. We have sand. So this is true sand. This is pretty well sorted, so our grain sizes are similar. We've got a lot of different colors going on in this though. There's a lot of clear grains, which are probably our quartz, our sort of toughest last minerals. But we've also got some kind of pinkish reds that are probably feldspars. We've got some blacks, magnetites, and hornblends. A lot of different materials still in this. So this is telling us this sand, while it is fairly small, fairly uniform in size, hasn't really had enough time to weather away some of the easier to weather minerals. And it has new material being added in. But right next to our sand, we also have a lot of these big cobbles. So this is a cobble sized. Most of these cobbles are basalt that's weathering. So I can't see individual grains or crystals, but I can see a little bit of these kind of pore spaces in them. Some of my rocks have a little bit of different colors going on. We even have some basalts where we can see two different size things going on. We have this really fine grained background, and then we have these individual large feldspar crystals visible in some of these. Sometimes these cobbles out on this beach will even have fossils in them. There's several sites around here that are producing fossils from our Cenozoic era, our age of mammals. And this is a great place to find them, not directly on this beach unless you have permits though, because these are vertebrate fossils that are covered under protection permits. So you have to have permits to collect in state parks for most of these places. A lot of this gravel is coming out of this stream that's coming in here. And this is actually a really important fossil site. The fossils coming out of here are from our Miocene time period. So kind of right in the middle of our age of mammals. A lot of this is about 15 million years old. And it's a cool example of mixing environments. Our main fossils that we find around here are whale fossils. There are a lot of sperm whale teeth, fossil sperm whale teeth, that come out of this site. The other main animal that we find represented in some of the fossils here are horses. So if we have a mix of a land animal and a marine ocean animal in the same place, what kind of environment might be mixing those kind of things together? Gee, something just like what we see today. We have a river coming in as a source to bring terrestrial materials like horse teeth in this case, meeting up with our ocean. So our source for our marine mammals. So these get mixed together. The fossils from the site are also really pretty. They're very jet black. So they have manganese as one of the elements that's replacing some of the organic material in the bones. And quite a few of these fossils are currently stored at University of Oregon. If we look out across the beach here again, we have some really cool coastal erosion. We can kind of see our wave cut platform. We're in sort of low tide right now. We have this piece here that's cut off from Hasita Head, so our headland here. Both of those are what we call sea stacks. So they've been isolated and cut off by wave action. Likely the waves started concentrating in on a weaker spot, eroding that material away. They might have started as small sea caves, eventually cut back to form an arch. As the erosion kept happening, our arch collapses and it leaves just our sea stack abandoned behind. These are kind of out on the tip, so they're experiencing the most force and energy from these waves hitting them and eroding them away. So on a geologic time scale, this will slowly disappear. We also have quite a selection of seagulls enjoying this area where we are mixing our fresh water and our salt water. A lot of little bathing seagulls out there. We can see some great sea caves getting cut back against the rock in different places here. Those are areas where the headland is starting to erode away over time. We have some fresh water seeping out of our banks there, flowing along our sand. We haven't gotten to this in our lecture yet, but this would represent a braided river system. So I have lots of different channels constantly moving and changing, leaving little sandbars and islands. Part of what's so cool with geology is that the same scale that makes huge rivers also works on a little micro scale here. We can see different minerals getting separated out by how our water is transporting this. A lot of our dark minerals have a higher density, so they're heavier, and they'll get kind of left behind because this varying amount of energy. We can also do a nice little experiment for our earthquake hazard. As I step on the sand, it sort of dries out a little bit around it. If I take my feet and move them back and forth, the water starts to come up. My feet start to sink down in the sand. This is a force called liquefaction. So see how like soft and squishy that is and easy to sink into? That's one of our big hazards after earthquakes. Water in between individual grains, sort of forcing the space open, and you can have buildings collapse into that. We won't be here at sunset for the field trip, so y'all can enjoy this really lovely view for a second. Adding a little on now that we're over closer to these sea caves, we can see each of these different spots where our erosion is cutting back into this cliff. We've got some really interesting geology exposed along here. We have our basalts. We also have some of this kind of breccia or conglomerate made out of our basalts, these kind of rubble piles here. And then if we look higher up on the cliff, we have these great exposures of conglomerate. If we zoom in here, these kind of sections where it's sort of dipping out here are channels that we're transporting this. So likely a river coming into our sort of beach area again. How much energy are we going to need to transport those large sort of pebbles and and cobbles and even some boulders in there. We've got a couple of different kinds of weathering going on here. We're going to have our physical weathering from stuff hitting up against this. We're going to have our chemical weathering from our water. We can see our fresh water dripping out of our cliffs. It's following a lot of these little fractures through our rock as kind of an easier path, eroding them out more. And think about how much energy it would take to get this up here. This is a cool example again of one of our igneous rocks. This is a basalt, but it's got a cool case of, we have that two different sizes of crystals. We have all these feldspar crystals, so all of these little white kind of long spiky bits in it, in this really fine grained matrix, so we can't see any individual crystals. And we can see our vesicles or our bubbles from our basalt as well. So this is a cool example that's very different than the basalt just behind it. So this has to have been transported to be here. How much energy is it going to take to put all of these big boulders of these different rock types back in here? If I sneak back in this cave, we even have this really cool example of, we have pieces trapped within these kind of other chunks. Even some neat little crystals growing around some of the spots here. So those are likely calcite crystals filling this in. Some different sizes of boulders. Here's this very back of the sea cave. I'm looking out of a sea cave here. Okay, so we were just back down at that beach. There's our Heceta Head Lighthouse. And so this is a really great place for a brief overview of, we can see all of these basalt layers that we've been looking at. This is the Yachats basalt. And we can also see some of these really rubbly areas that we saw a little bit closer over by Heceta Head. These are an ancient volcanic landslide. So they have big cobbles and boulders of the basalt that's all mixed up, stacked on top of itself. It looks like it got maybe rolled around in the ocean a little bit, because we have a conglomerate, so rounded edges, rather than our breccia, the sharp angular edges. This is just a neat view for kind of starting to put this together. Again, we can also see a lot of our coastal erosion in action. So we have headlands that stick out into the ocean. They're breaking our mean wave force, so they're experiencing a lot more erosion. This is why we're getting all of those sea caves that are being undermined in around where the lighthouse is. We can zoom in on our lighthouse. Again, apologies for my crappy phone quality, but that's that beach right over in here that we were walking around earlier. We can just barely see those sea caves there. We can see our wave cut platform for our current sea level. But we have a neat opportunity here. We can also see this platform that our lighthouse is built on. And the head of this other headland here have an additional wave cut platform showing when sea level was different than it was today. And since we're here at sunset, I'll just do a nice little pan. It's really very pretty. Okay, this is gonna be another sort of bonus stop. This is the spouting horn pullout. But we really nicely can see, looking back across here, this wave cut platform or wave cut terrace. So this very flat layer, it extends out for a lot of these rocks here, is cut by wave action. This is really cool because it can tell us about a history of sea level change. Look for flat areas cut at higher elevations. We've got a lot of cool things going on here too. If we look at this mountain up above, we can kind of faintly see these layers in it. Those are going to be basalt. So we've got a lot of this coastal basalt that we've been seeing making up this platform here. And we also have some more great coastal erosion and a lot of wave action going on here. Tide's not quite high enough or not stormy enough to really see a ton of actions at the Spouting Horn, but we can see these big waves coming in and watching them crash against these headlands here. Those are going to be the areas most concentrating a lot of the erosion. Neat little place where we've got some fresh water coming in and a little waterfall necessitated building this bridge for Highway 101. Area with a lot of erosion going on. Okay, I'm just over a mile south of Sea Lion Caves, which are quite cool. If you're coming back through here at some point, they're worth stopping and checking out. Unfortunately, they won't do a group discount for us, so that's part of why we're not going. But this is a really neat overview now for our dunes portion. Even though the name of this trip was Dunes, we've actually looked at a lot of other features. Everything south of here is where we really start the system of the Oregon dunes. We can see these piles of sand. We have our active beach area, and then we have this sort of back of the beach area that starts forming these dunes. They're largely running parallel to our ocean. We can think about the direction our waves are coming in, how they're going to impact supplying sand. So in the winter, when we have more storms, when we have bigger waves, we're going to get a lot more of our sand getting pulled out into our ocean. Whereas during the summer, when we have less energy in our waves, less storms, smaller waves, we're going to be piling a lot more sand up on our beach. It's not all just staying stationary too. We can also think about longshore drift. So this is the direction sand is getting pushed up or down our coastline. And we've got some pretty good variation going on here. One of our biggest factors for transport with dunes, though, is going to be wind or aeolian processes. So think about scooping up a handful of sand and gravel in your hand and blowing on it as hard as you can. What size pieces are you going to be able to move by doing this? We're not going to be blowing gravel. We're not going to be moving gravel with wind. It's just going to be sand. And even within our sand, this is going to be our really most fine-grained sand. So dune sands tend to be what we call really well sorted. It's consistently the same size. It's fine-grained, so very small pieces. And we can see these angles that they're starting to stack up at. If we cut a cross section through our dunes, we would see cross beds, so angles the sand's deposited on at bigger scales, higher angles than we would see for our beaches or our rivers. So that'll be a key thing to think about by the time we get all the way down to Horsefall Dunes eventually on the trip. Okay, we've just gone south a little ways on the highway. These are now those dunes that we were just starting to see from that overlook. So I'm looking at the back of the dunes here. We can see if we zoom in even some of those layers, those cross beds starting to form. This is on the back side. So these are wind transported, and they're really changing a lot of the erosion, weathering, and deposition of new sediments along the coast here. So we have our source. Our ocean is weathering and eroding this material down. This is clastic, lots of little clasts of sand. Wind is transporting it and stacking it up. It's forming these series of dunes. They're even allowing there to be a lake behind them. So we have this little lake or lagoon where our water table intersects the surface here on the backside of our dunes. Likely this lake is so close to our ocean, lake, This is probably brackish, so it probably has some seawater traveling through our dunes, because our sand is going to have high porosity, lots of space in between our grains, and high permeability, a lot of connection between the pore spaces in those grains. So these can be really important habitats. This is also a little bit of a sad story though, and that if we look at these dunes out here, they're covered in grasses. Most of these grasses, not all, but most of these grasses aren't native. Many of these were intentionally introduced because people were worried about erosion in the dunes. Even though the erosion was a natural process, people didn't want the dunes moving around. They wanted to stabilize them. Why would we want to have the dunes stay in place? Well, if you have a house built next to one, or a road, maybe like a major US highway in some cases, potentially you don't want the sand moving around as much. So a lot of these plants, several of these grasses, ice plants, were introduced from other areas in the world to stabilize the dunes and have subsequently become invasive species. So these are species that damage native ecosystems, threaten native plants and animals, and can be really problematic. Dune grasses are here to stay though. There's really nothing at this point we could do to change these. There are places where we are managing and trying to remove some of them, but it's a pretty difficult process. If we zoom in, we can see a little flickering light out there. That's likely a cargo vessel that's a ways off the coast. And my one other thing I want to mention, as we're right here on 101, is we have entering tsunami hazard zone. All of our low-lying areas here along the coast are big risks for tsunamis. Tsunamis can be caused by a variety of factors. Our most common cause for tsunamis, though, is earthquakes. If you think about having your seafloor and suddenly moving it up or down, all of that water sitting on top of it gets shoved really quickly. And that wave that buckles up slowly propagates out from that initial point where the earthquake occurred. Out in open ocean, these waves don't necessarily look very big. We think of our wave form, so crest, trough, crest. One wavelength is from the same point, so crest, trough, crest in that case. The actual amplitude or height of our wave is often only sort of 3 to 5 feet out in deep water. But our wavelength, our distance between those tops of those waves can be 500 miles. Huge, huge distances. The reason why tsunamis are so dangerous is as that huge long wave, but very shallow wave, reaches in towards the coast, all of that energy has to be conserved. So when that bottom part of it starts to drag along the bottom, it slows down the front. So our hundreds of mile long wave, the front of it starts to slow down. The back of it doesn't though. So quickly, if the back of it is running up on top of the front of it, we're conserving that same total amount of string. So if you picture our wave, little waveform here, if that front part is slowing down and we have a string that's that length, we're shortening our wavelength, but we're really greatly increasing the amplitude. So the name tsunami is Japanese for wave in the harbor. We don't really see that big wave until we've slowed down the front of it enough for it to then really close to land turn into this enormous giant wave. Because earthquakes are our leading cause, we are particularly concerned about them here along the Oregon coast because of Cascadia megathrust events. Potentially these could cause very large tsunamis. We know we had large tsunamis in this area, both from geologic deposits, so we can see churned up seafloor materials way up on hillsides. We can see places where, because of the earthquake dropping the land down, we drowned forest and have ocean deposits all around it. But we can also rely on indigenous legends. Multiple coastal tribes along Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia have legends explaining this last Cascadia megathrust event. One of my favorite stories is that of Thunderbird and Whale. So the idea is that Thunderbird and Whale had been enemies for many, many years, and finally they got in this huge fight. And Thunderbird, in trying to win, reached down and scooped up Whale, brought Whale over land, and dropped Whale. Whales don't really like to be on land. This caused this huge jolt in the land as the enormous body of Whale hit it. Several smaller jolts afterwards were Whale scooting back into the ocean. Then, to try and get a little bit of revenge and a last word on Thunderbird, Whale smashed his tail into the water, causing a massive wave to come up on the land. These stories tell of this battle happening on the first full moon after the winter solstice. Looking back at past calendars, this tells us the exact day and even time. It happened at night that in January that our Cascadia megathrust earthquake last happened. We can then take records from Japan of what they called the orphan wave. They knew that earthquakes happened and then caused tsunamis. In the case of the orphan wave, there was no earthquake they felt, and yet suddenly this huge wave showed up, destroyed several towns, so it's called the orphan wave. They recorded the day and the year that happened. So combining these multiple records that people were keeping on opposite sides of the ocean, we know exactly when our last Cascadia megathrust earthquake happened.